All right, moving into our next grouping, we've got framing, layers, and angle. And framing and layers are very linked, and angle has a lot to do too in terms of setting up a composition. So let's take a look at framing. It's fairly straightforward. It just simply means using foreground objects to create a shape in the composition. And a lot of times, especially in 2D, when we're painting or taking photographs, we're struggling with the fact that we have a frame at the edge of our paper or the screen. Well, a framing element can help blur that edge and bring us, our viewer, into the scene a little bit more. So then the edge of the paper is no longer as important as the edge of the frame inside the image that's framing the subject of the image. So an architectural shape, a doorway, a window, that kind of thing, looking through an arch, is very common in art. As a framing element, but it doesn't need to be the only kind of framing element. Here, the elephant in the midground is clearly the focus of this. We've got some sort of blurry giraffes and zebras back there, but the framing element is the elephant right in front of us. We're looking through the legs and belly of this elephant as a framing element, looking at the elephant in the middle ground. So framing can be creative. It doesn't necessarily just have to be some kind of border around the edges of it. And any kind of foreground objects can be useful for that. So these are all three good examples of framing elements, even though they're not as obvious as looking through a doorway or something that's completely filling the foreground space. So even this woman sitting under the tree here, you see that in paintings and in fine art all the time, some kind of object. So there's this little branch kind of arching over her there and creating this kind of little cozy space underneath there, underneath that framing element that really helps that composition. And a framing doesn't always have to be in front of the subject. It can be behind the subject, as it is in this photograph. You see this all the time in film now. So here we are kind of eavesdropping on this conversation. We have these blurry, out-of-focus people right in front of us, and we're looking beyond them to this couple across the table. That gives us a very sort of intimate feel, like we're sort of peeking in at their world with a sort of voyeuristic way by having this framing element in the foreground. We can see framing as something that happens in portraiture as well. So all these portraits have some kind of framing element. The reason maybe why your high school senior photographer had you rest your chin on your hand or something like that to create some kind of framing interest in the image. Cropping is also really common right now, where you can draw interest to a different part of the image by chopping out other parts of the image. So the one down here on the right here, the woman's hand with her cigarette, is really prominent in this, whereas if we were looking at her whole body, we'd be distracted by her eyes and her face, all kinds of other things. We wouldn't be looking at that little cigarette in her hand so much. You can see this in film a lot too now, where there'll be somebody on the phone, and maybe even the phone is out of the shot, but they're talking on the phone, and you can only see like one eye and part of their face or whatever, and then watching the eye movements, the one area that you do get to see in the crop, becomes really fascinating. So cropping is a powerful tool to draw your attention to some other part of a composition that might not get as much attention as it would otherwise. Breaking the frame suggests movement. There's our horse again. We've got our little fighter jet, and of course Cailbeau's Paris Rainy Day, which is a great example of kind of a snapshot before there were snapshots, really. All these people sort of moving in and out of the frame, creating a real sense of movement on this street scene. Just a couple of terms to be aware of here. Vignette is a kind of a flaw of old photography where it would get overexposed around the edges, and now that's done intentionally to create a kind of a framing element, to make it dark around the edges, to make a photograph look antique or maybe a little mysterious or sinister. You can see the reverse of that, a white vignette, kind of a fuzzy outline. You see that like wedding photography all the time, where it makes this kind of dreamy quality to that. There's some kind of framing element by changing the value of the edges of the image is called vignette. You can also see that in cinematography as well, if the camera is looking through something. So our hero is looking through binoculars, and we see the binoculars around the edges of the scene, so it looks like we're looking through the binoculars at that moment in the film. That's also called vignette in cinematography as well. Now layers is a really big one. Layers is basically planes of focus, and these terms foreground, middle ground, background, this seems kind of obvious, but it does take some consideration as you're setting up a composition to really bear these in mind. It's really easy to identify layers and planes of focus in somebody else's artwork. It takes a little bit more effort to make sure that you're including it in your own. So if we take a look at this image, we've got foreground here, obviously the table and all of the stuff on it, but don't forget the beam up above as well as foreground elements. The background is pretty straightforward. It's kind of beyond the plane here, the haystack in the background and the sky. And then of course the middle ground is almost always always the layer with the subject. So we've got the wall, the door, and the two people in this image. Very much the subject of this photo in that middle ground. And this has been going on for centuries. Vermeer loved to do this back in the 1600s. So there'll be some kind of framing object, some kind of foreground object like this curtain here. He loved to paint things through windows and doorways and down narrow hallways and all that kind of stuff. So it's not a new thing. And framing and layers frequently appears at the same time as in this bit of concept art here, where we have a dark sort of framing area in the foreground of these buildings, kind of looking out at that center middle ground sunlit area, and then we've got the little bit blurry city line behind the wall back there. Aerial perspective is a term that you've probably heard before, and that just simply means that objects that are closer are darker and more saturated, and obviously more detailed than the objects in the distance. So you get this sort of purple mountain majesty happening, where as we look farther away at something, there's a whole lot more sort of particulates in the air. This is extremely visible on a smoky day or a foggy day, overcast day, where there's a lot of particulates in the air. There's moisture vapors or smoke or smog or whatever that's really making things far away from us. We're looking through 2 miles of particles to really knock down the saturation of the images way in the distance. So you can clearly see 5 or 6 different planes of the hills in this image as we move farther and farther away from the camera. And grayscale is a great way to indicate depth in the thumbnail. So basically we have that same kind of aerial perspective in a sense going on in this thumbnail sketch for an image here, where we've got the black foreground images and then we move progressively lighter as we get back against the sky. And here you can see the finished version of that rendering. This is real common to have kind of elements in the foreground, or rocks or something, or a column or whatever. Foreground framing elements are very common in concept art and all kinds of things these days. Depth of field is pretty straightforward, and that's back to the optical focus that we've already taken a look at. We can physically control the lenses to make something be our subject matter. In the case, the out of focus thing in the foreground here, a little vase in the foreground, and then the out of focus vases in the background. But the one in the middle there is the subject of our photograph here, and that's the one in the clear optical focus. And depth of field and framing can be used together, like in this image where we have these out of focus banisters that are making this little keyhole window at the in focus skateboarder who is the subject of this photo. Bokeh is a word just to be aware of because it's used a lot these days, and just simply means a lens effect of out-of-focus points of light. So this is a lovely photograph of what otherwise would just be kind of a busy urban street, but it looks like a Christmas tree or something because it's all these little bulbs of light that are simply just street lights and signs and things out of focus. That can create a dramatic effect. Another one, it's kind of a flaw that's become a popular intentional thing to do now, is lens flare. And that's just when light is shining directly into the lens and it actually creates a bad artifact in the photograph. But it's being used intentionally a lot in film today, especially in science fiction, because it creates a very glossy, kind of slick feel. And that's largely due to the fact that this director here is doing a lot of these science fiction films and loves to use lens flares almost to a fault. Angle is a hugely important one. Another one that's so obvious when you're looking at somebody else's work, but you have to stop and think about it when you're doing your own. So the angle or the point of view of your viewer is very important in a composition. So this is clearly a GoPro or something on the helmet of this bicyclist. So we're seeing his or her point of view from the top of their helmet. So the point of view over the handlebars makes this a very, action shot. We're used to the term over-the-shoulder point of view or first-person point of view or all that kind of stuff if you're playing any kind of games. There's also the angle of the point of view has a lot to do with the composition. So here's 2 examples of images that are at a very high angle, but it's a familiar point of view. So looking down at a soup bowl from almost straight ahead is how we view a bowl of soup, right? When you sit down and eat some soup, you're looking down at it just like this. If this was a photograph of this bowl of soup from a kind of a landscape setup here, where we were looking at the side of the bowl and the spoon sticking out, we wouldn't see the soup. It'd be, maybe we see a little few carrots or something peeking over the rim, but we wouldn't get the view of a bowl of soup the way that we want to see the soup, which is looking down at it. Same thing as looking at this kid. We're used to looking down at a kid, so that doesn't make that a particularly unusual kind of focus. However, that same kind of high angle, looking down at something that we're not used to seeing from that angle, like a person, can make for a very dramatic effect. And then a low angle, I sort of like to call that sort of kid's point of view, right? We're sort of intimidated when we're small, where everything is big and scary. So when you're looking up from a very low angle, it can create a scary looming effect. Like in this photograph here, that's sort of foreshortened up to the top of the house, and it looks like we're a very small kid coming up, being on a dare, going up to the haunted house. Extreme low angle. Hopefully you haven't seen this sort of gutter cam view very often in your life. If so, that's probably bad things are happening to you. But that's a really exciting image there. All these triangles, this one-point perspective, kind of zooming down to that car in the middle of the image. It's a really cool composition by setting the camera actually on the ground to take this really interesting image. So we get these really low angle views can give us a very dramatic effect as well. Low angle looking up can create something called a 3-point perspective. So on the image on the right here, in the forest, probably not looking at that image thinking like, how odd that all the trees are leaning toward the center. No, we just see that as like, okay, yeah, there's kind of a fisheye thing going on here, and all these trees are very tall, and that's creating that 3-point perspective feel going on. So if you look at the building here, the little cubes going up the side of the building, they have the regular 2-point perspective going on. Their lines are vanishing off into different vanishing points like normal, but they have a third line of perspective. As they go up the building, they're getting progressively smaller as they get farther away from us. So there's this foreshortening effect, and the classic example of this is looking up or looking down at skyscrapers, because they have these long lines where we can see that foreshortening. Usually things that we're seeing that are that big have more organic shapes. You know, if you're looking down a cliff face or whatever, the lines are much more kind of broken and organic. But in the case of a building, you've got a 600-foot long straight line that can really clearly show the 3-point perspective going on. Angles can exaggerate or reveal shapes. If the photographer was down there on the balcony level with those people with the tables and such, they'd be very different composition. We wouldn't be getting all these interesting triangles and diamond shapes and things. So only from this high angle perspective can we really see a lot of these shapes. And of course, a high angle can emphasize the height. So we can sort of look down below the subject at how high they are to exaggerate that effect. Then an extreme angle can be an effective way to do a dramatic effect. I just absolutely love this photograph of the woman reflected in the railroad rail. I mean, what a really creative way to compose an image. And then, of course, there's the film noir view, all these sort of strange angles, sort of expressionism, all that kind of thing, where you're looking at people from weird angles to create an alienating or spooky, mysterious effect. Foreshortening is simply extreme perspective, and that's, this is a photograph of a guy pulling a gun, right? And the gun is taking up a huge amount of the proportion of the image, even though it's out of focus. But it's because it's so big, it's being foreshortened. I mean, his fist is bigger than his head, just like Superman's fist down over here. It's right in our face, and it's much bigger than things that are farther away. So foreshortening, again, a term you're probably familiar with, but it just is an extreme perspective coming straight at the viewer. And that's it for this second group. So we'll be back with thirds and odds and a lot of other important stuff here in the next video.